Recorded mic is back, everybody. Hello, lovelies. I made a video many months ago now called How I Design Stuff, where I go through my basic process of designing clothes. However, I only made a few minutes of time to talk about how I draw things in this process, and I love this part so much, so I wanted to make its own video for how I do fashion illustration. So, to the drawing board. Now, before I actually start drawing anything, the first two things that I do are gather my references and my materials. If I am already going off of a concept that is already existing, like a character, a color scheme, an aesthetic, whatever, I find a couple screenshots and use those to jumpstart my ideas. One of my favorite design collections that I've ever made was a series of dresses inspired by different Disney parks attractions, where I used colors, aesthetics, logos to inspire the outfits themselves. The next thing is my materials. First and foremost, my sketch pad. She has been with me. She has been there, done that. This is my favorite of my sketchbooks. General sketch paper is usually gonna be the kind of quality you want. I also sometimes use Bristol paper, but it's way more expensive. It comes in huge 14 by 17 inch sheets, and it works all right, but not super conducive cost-wise. I also care a lot about paper quality, specifically because of the colors that I use. A lot of watercolors and alcohol markers, so printer paper doesn't work great because it tends to bleed a lot. Now, like I said, when it comes to colors, I primarily use alcohol markers. Do they bleed a lot? Yes. Do they get great coverage in vibrant colors? Also yes, hence why I choose them. I'll sometimes use watercolors here and there for large spaces that I need to fill, and I can nicely layer details over them, but it is much more tedious and time consuming than the way I normally do with alcohol markers, and then layering colored pencils on top for details, highlights and shadows, etc. And the last and maybe the most important part of all of my materials is my sketch model. I have used the same one for probably 2 or 3 years now, and I have used it for every drawing ever since. I like the proportions since it's not as exaggerated as other fashion models, but it still kind of gives that fashion illustration aesthetic. Now, masculine models. I haven't found one that I like yet, but I also don't design menswear enough to warrant really needing to find one. And now, onto the actual sketching process. Before I start actually illustrating any clothing pieces, I start with my model. I usually have a number of pre-drawn models that I make in bulk, so I don't always have to take the time to make more. Full disclosure, I do trace them. I like to have all the illustrations stay in a cohesive scale and look, so tracing is usually my best option. Now for the actual garment sketching, the first thing I like to do is outline the neckline, skirt silhouette, and sleeves. Starting with that gives me the framework for the rest of the drawing. Next, I sketch out the larger details like the basic construction and layers, and this is usually when I like to add the hairstyle and accessories to see how the look will pull together. Once the final sketch is done, it's time for colors. I start with my alcohol markers for the base layers of everything. I use this reference sheet that I made to see how the colors will actually look on paper, so I know I'm choosing the right ones. I don't do any detailing with these since they bleed way too much and they don't blend as well as pencils. This is where watercolors have the leg up since they blend so nicely, color can be easily controlled, and shading can also be done at the same time. However, watercolors take a long time to look nice, so markers are the quicker option. The only things I don't use markers on are skin and hair since I don't have a great shade range, but now it's pencil time. For each color of my marker, I find one darker and one lighter pencil, plus the extra ones I need for skin, hair, accessories, etc. I don't have a specific order to how I do this part, I just go in between shadows and highlights, alternating to make sure the lighting with the shape of the garment makes sense. General rule of thumb is that highlights will be on the places that are elevated in some way, and shadows go where there is an indent. I don't like to be too heavy-handed with either since it can throw off the lighting of the whole drawing. Looking at images of certain materials or finding them in person to see how they look in normal lighting has helped me so much. I wish I could explain this part better, but honestly, I've just kind of learned to feel it out and see what looks right. There's a lot of great diagrams available for this, and I've found them in the past on Pinterest. Pinterest helps so much for finding fabric and garment construction references, as well as illustration tips. After I feel good with my lighting, I go all in on details, jewelry, specific stitching patterns, and I usually like to add makeup, especially if it contributes to the look. To top it all off, I'll use a black thin tip marker specifically for the lashes, and sometimes I'll outline parts of the garment itself. I don't outline every line, just the ones that I feel like need to differentiate from one another. The last thing I like to do is more for me than anything. I sign and date my work. I love looking at illustrations I've made and how both my sewing and drawing skills have improved over time. There are some pieces that have multiple iterations across multiple years, which is also pretty cool to look at. I've also watched my progression as I develop a very specific visual style, one that's often based on looks from Disney princesses, vintage clothing, and more specific designers like Alexander McQueen, Schiaparelli under the creative direction of Daniel Roseberry, and Givenchy under the creative direction of Sarah Burton. Developing your own visual aesthetic isn't exactly necessary, but it's always cool to see which visual elements come up consistently across different works, even spanning past clothing and fashion illustration. With all that said, I hope this was helpful in some way, shape, or form. I absolutely love sharing about design and art, and I really want to try to keep up making videos, even though my resources are quite limited. I have a couple possible projects in the upcoming future, don't know if they'll happen or not. In my professional opinion, though, I highly recommend subscribing and following me on Instagram and TikTok so you can stay updated when these things get posted. I don't have a posting schedule right now, but I just have a hope and a dream and a sewing machine. New tagline unlocked? Bye!
Are you gonna eat a donut, Kylan?
Yeah.